first of all, I'd like to welcome you all to Aston University, and particularly to Aston Students' Union. This is our building designed with students and which opened May, June, and we're beginning to discover what a wonderful building it is. So today's about public art in Birmingham, and the reason why it's important that we host it here is that Aston's all about its beneficiaries, its students, the businesses and organisations of Birmingham, but also the region. And we feel that we have a social responsibility to play a part in the region, and art is very important. So I'd like to, first of all, introduce our key speaker, Jonathan Watkins, and he's going to talk for about half an hour, and then we have a panel discussion on the role of public art, using as a start the beautiful sculpture that you probably saw when you came in, and then moving on towards a wider discussion around what art means within the city of Birmingham. So, Jonathan, I've lost him. There we are.
How nice it is to be here on this autumnal evening, and to say that I'll try and talk for less than 30 minutes, because I think the panel discussion will be so interesting, and then a chance for more conversation to take place. So this is a whistle-stop tour that I'm going to give you, a whistle-stop tour of Ikon's off-site programme since I've been there at Ikon, and as well a whistle-stop tour of Birmingham. I'm going to take you on a walk from Ikon to Aston University, and we're stopping off on the way at various off-site projects that we've undertaken. Why do we do it? Why do we work in the public realm? It's the kind of thing that's going to be talked about in more detail later, and different aspects of public art. But to say, essentially for us, it's not a question of sort of elevating space or population. It's more in keeping with the philosophy that we have at Ikon over all of our programme, our learning programme, our galleries, and our public relations, everything, is that we want to assert the continuity between art and everyday life. And a good way of doing that is by putting artwork sort of in the way of everyday life. One of the first projects that happened after I arrived in 2001, this is a work by Julian Opie from 1997, My Aunt's Sheep. These almost childish stylized versions of sheep. It's as if they've strayed out of the space, the gallery space, the space dedicated for art, and they're sort of mingling in Brindley Place. They remind me very much of the English coast, a painting by Holman Hunt, where the sheep have sort of gone astray, and well, appropriate that it should be happening in Birmingham then, just in the year 2001. That's shortly after I arrived. What we have now is this work by Barry Flanagan. So we have a hare in Brindley Place, and this is the large troubadour, a bronze sculpture. So unlike Julian Opie's two-dimensional stylized sheep, we've got this sort of wonderful, thoughtful hare, very much referencing Rodin's Thinker, and he's sitting against a cello. Barry Flanagan loved cellos. In fact, when he was at Central St Martin's as a student, he learned to play the cello. In particular, he wanted to play Bach's cello suites, and recently we've had a performance of two of those suites, around his exhibition. This is a bronze sculpture that was made previously, 2004. We placed it, we didn't commission it, but the controversial Birmingham family, a real Birmingham family, was one that we did commission by Gillian Waring. the artist who's responsible for the Millicent Fawcett sculpture that was unveiled in Westminster not so long ago. We were there in 2014 with Gillian, an artist from Birmingham, and this conventional-looking sculpture is very much the tip of an iceberg. It was a long journey to get to this. We had the title A Real Birmingham Family, not an ideal Birmingham family or what we sort of felt a family should be. It was very much the outcome of an outreaching that we did. Every district in Birmingham, we went out with a sort of photo booth and a display that relates to the demographic of Birmingham. You know, who are the people who live here, how old are they, what are their cultural heritages, and we asked them to define what a family was. And then we had a panel. It was a bit like a Turner Prize competition, and 4 families were shortlisted, and it was the Jones family, 2 sisters and their 2 boys, Roma and Emma, and their 2 boys, and you can see that a 3rd boy was on the way. We didn't realise when they were chosen that she would become pregnant, but it's a sort of a beautiful fact that Gillian Waring incorporated into the work, and it's been now replaced in Centenary Square. This this is where it is. Has just recently been recited. Now I say that because I want to remind you of what Centenary Square used to look like. Remember the work of Tess Jarre here in the pavement, and this is looking out from where the new library is, and this is a work by the German artist Wolfgang Weierleder. It's called House Birmingham, and a point that this artist wants to make is how cities with architectural structures, our built environment, supposedly kind of solid and permanent, often sort of asserting a permanence, are usually in flux. And this work that we've recently been showing at Ikon, maybe we're still showing it as a video in our reception area. It's a sort of collaboration with a building company and apprentice bricklayers, actually, and these structures were kind of dancing around the square. They went up, they went down, and they moved. And when you see a sort of quick time-lapse film documentation of this, you watch these terrace house shapes sort of dance around this public square. A lot of people thought that maybe there was some residential housing being put up in the middle of Centenary Square, and we had to be sort of continuously there on behalf of the local authority to say that this actually wasn't happening. But the whole thing of process is very important to us. You know, the Gillian Waring work, an unusually bronze sculpture. It's particularly interesting as an outcome of the process that was undertaken, which is explained in the plaque beneath it, and then this kind of typically temporary project by Wolfgang Weierleder, another German artist. We're now moving away from Ikon, we're moving over Centenary Square, and the point that, of course, Weierleder making about buildings going up and buildings going down, this is the famous Birmingham Central Library, designed by John Maydin, such a strong piece of architecture in a brutalist style. Katharina Grosser in 2002, with an all-female group of artists from around Birmingham, were on 6 stories of scaffolding in order to create what looks like a kind of spontaneous graffiti, some kind of guerrilla activity with colour, very much foiled by the greyness of this work. This literary building foiling this amazing sort of colourful abstraction. You know, tens of, I think more like 100 meters long, this particular work. And here's another angle. Just to take you back to the way Paradise Circus used to look. Now, some buildings are still there. In particular, the Old Town Hall, and Queen Victoria is still there on her pedestal. We've just recently made an exhibition with the Guyanese artist Hugh Locke, and his dream is to put more Queen Victorias on the pedestal. His dream is to make this temporary intervention within the foreseeable future, whereby Queen Victoria is transformed into a kind of voodoo queen, and it's as if she is arising out of some kind of crating, and she's surrounded by lots of little Queen Victorias, as if she's on the way around the world to drop them off. And you know, it was his experience as a child in Georgetown in Guyana. Queen Victoria was sort of very prominent, and it was, a memory that was seared into his mind. And I've just actually recently returned from Ghana, and there is a statue of Queen Victoria there. I mean, there are so many of them, and it's not a critique of royalty so much as a different way of looking at it. I mean, from the point of view of somebody who comes not from the heart of empire, but from a corner of what was the empire, but is now an independent state. Now, if we go down from Victoria Square, turn right before you get to New Street, you were going through Fletcher's Walk. We had a film program, an outdoor film program that was there, and around the city. It was called About Town. This is still from Gillian Waring's film Dancing in Peckham, where she's dancing in a shopping arcade. So it felt very appropriate that we would have this film of her dancing in an arcade But it was one of a number of projects that we undertook. And if you then went further down to Southside, down Her Street, to a large car park at the bottom of Her Street, you saw this large film installation by the Swiss artist Beat Streuling. There was Fletcher's Walk, there was this car park installation, and many more installations up and down Her Street. And this then led to we're taking off now from Birmingham Airport, probably via Dubai or Istanbul to Bahrain, because then this project led to an extraordinary film installation, something that Alistair, Hicks and I organised in association with the Bahrain Art Fair. And it was here that we showed a number of Birmingham-based artists, but also we showed Marko Mäetamm. And that is the cue to show you a snippet from a film that we showed in Fletcher's Walk. And it's typically funny. It's a silent film. Well, this video has no sound. It's a silent film, and it's typically self-deprecating, smart, beguiling sense of humour. I'm not going to play the whole thing, Marko, but I'm going to stop when your daughter comes around and makes, a very funny gesture. It's great that she's holding a knife, I think, isn't it? There's more, and I'm not going to tell you how it ends. Now, if you then go a little bit further southwest, you find yourself in the mailbox, and you'll find yourself in the basement where there's now Associated Architects. Offices were created there for this architectural firm, but we took the opportunity to install this 24-metre stuffed cashmere whale project by the Italian artist Claudia Losey, an artist with a very strong environmental proposition to her work. It's more evidence, actually, of the kind of opportunism that characterises our programme. We don't necessarily, we don't want to take over a place forever and install something, there, from now until Kingdom Come. The same thing applies to the Fletcher's Walk programme. We can see there's a shop that's empty. We can see that there's a space that's opened up, and maybe there's a kind of matchmaking that can occur, and giving the artist a particularly interesting context, which enriches the artistic statement he or she wishes to make. This whole business of lying on the floor, more recently seen in the work we did with Roger Hyons in 2016, the Evensong, the Untitled Evensong. It was actually an Evensong. It wasn't a performance, but it was actually a service that was undertaken. There was the choir master. These are the choristers, and the dean of Birmingham St Philip's Cathedral gave a lecture on the symbolic significance of the horizontality and verticality in Christianity, and she made that reference very smartly to the crucifixion. So the audience, the congregation, is all the way around the nave where normally the pews would be, and they're also in the gallery. It's nice too. You've got the horizontality of the children, and then you have the verticality of the figures in this Ascension by Edward Burne-Jones. The idea of resurrection is very important to Cornelia Parker. So now we're going down New Street towards the Bull Ring, and here her idea was to transform the rotunda into a kind of Roman candle, whereby the sort of pyrotechnical mixture of the fireworks included a piece of pulverized meteorite. So this, this small heavenly body that had fallen to Earth was then sent back into the heavens as part of a fireworks display. This was a project around the millennium, and you see, every now and then I think we should have done this differently, but you see around St Martin's in the Bull Ring these plaques in the pavement telling you that a meteorite fell in China and then it was sent into the skies and then fell again on Birmingham. People will be bemused by that. What they won't know, because we don't say it, well, one, it was commissioned by Ikon, and the other is that the artist was Cornelia Parker. Then around the corner from, actually in the same kind of location, but not directly on the same place, we did this project with Peter Liversidge in 2005, reminding us of what the world was like prehistorically. A project which is nicely caught between St Martin's in the Bull Ring and Selfridges, between an old neo-Gothic building and the work of Future Systems. We're quite interested in this juxtaposition, God and Mammon. Yes, we do work with corporations and retail environments. This is a project that we did over the new year with Belgium-based artist Perry Roberts, where the names of the seasons were cut up and shuffled in this shop front, and the idea of the seasons determining the kind of the calendar of a shop. Mixing up seasons was something that intrigued him. So Selfridges is, it's 5-star blue chip shopping. The markets around the corner, absolutely sort of fascinating and a great place to be. This is the Japanese artist Tatsumi Orimoto, who, absolutely kind of pertinently in the light of the observations that I was just making, he wanted to walk around the market, but was fascinated by the fact that there was a church there, and he, being Japanese, was always interested that in the Christian religion there's the idea of transubstantiation, and that he thinks of Jesus as a bread man, that the bread becomes Jesus and Jesus is the bread. And so he walks around the church as ringing a bell as the bread man. A number of Japanese artists are featured in our program. They often work with audiences and performances. Social engagement, relational aesthetics is very often their kind of thing. Shimabuku undertook this project with 100 volunteers when the sky was sea in what is now referred to as Curzon Square, which is where the terminus of HS2 is going to be. At that stage, it was a large expanse of grass. You can see where the trains pass, the low-speed trains pass. There, and look, there is one. And there are some volunteers. We had, on a couple of occasions, artist picnics in this place. And very nice it was, too. So there you are. You've got people flying kites who could be seen, through the windows of the passing trains. The idea that the sky becomes the sea by flying these fish kites is a kind of an inversion of a natural order of things. The idea of the fast train, although this, I don't think that HS2 was on his mind, but certainly Curzon Street Station, this building was on ours, and we worked around it for a number of years. And here is a slow walk by Hamish Fulton, an artist who insists on a bit more meditation and a little less speed in life. And he wanted people to spend an entire day walking across this raised platform of concrete, which is actually no longer there. So, of course, those people that were whizzing by on the not so high, not so low speed train, the Virgin trains, would see these people walking very, very slowly across this urban wasteland behind the Curzon Street building. So the idea of something slow also occurring too, and interesting as we're getting closer and closer to Aston, the work of Tom and Simon Blore, two Birmingham-based artists. This is the beginning of our continuous program of working on the canals of Birmingham, and of course the canal sort of comes by very close to here. This work preceding the 1418 now Dazzle ships. I mean, we did it in Birmingham with, let's say Tom and Simon, who are here with us tonight, they did it in Birmingham. And this was the shuttle that took you from Brindley Place to Eastside. It took, because of all the locks in the way, it took about a day, really. It was very low speed navigation of the canals. Now you will, on the way to Digbeth, come by Aston University, and you stopped off that stage, you'd have seen the sort of busyness of university life, but in the middle of it all, there would have been a gap, a space, a Marko Mäetamm shaped hole. And I just want to say how proud we are, and actually thanks to Aston University for involving us in this project in the small way. But it has been a privilege, and it's been fantastic reconnecting with Marko Mäetamm. Now, if you got off that boat today and wandered around, you'd have the huge privilege of seeing that. And it's not, I can't stress, it's not by Ikon, but we love looking at it. Thank you very much.
So we thought that rather than spend a lot of time introducing the panel, on your chair there should be a small biography of each of the panel, but suffice to say, we've got Alistair, Theresa, Roxanna, Abid, and of course Marko. And the idea was that we would start by asking each of them to answer one question and then open out to further discussion. So Marko, we have to begin with you because the sculpture is so wonderful. And what we wanted to do was to ask you about your choice of material and subject and how the beautiful sculpture out there, how it relates to your wider practice and indeed your films.
Well, yeah, my practice in general is pretty sort of diverse, and also I've learned or studied the printmaking when I was a student, but these days I'm kind of doing a little bit of everything. It depends on the situation and the project or whatever. But I think that puts it all together or draws it all together is kind of autobiographical aspects of it. So I don't know actually why one should make works which are not somehow related to the person himself or herself. So I'm trying to speak about things which are which I feel like I have feet on the ground and I know what I'm saying, even if nobody probably agrees with it. Or maybe people say, okay, you are talking rubbish, it's stupid, I don't really care. But okay, you don't really care, but that's my story, you know. I don't have any other lives to talk about. So I have had loads of discussions like that. So this particular work is actually growing out of my endless sort of dilemma of not being much of a reading person. So this is kind of my confession, actually. I've studied. Of course, I was in secondary school. I had problems with reading. Then I was in the art university. I had problems with reading. Then I was even a dean of fine art department. I had terrible problems with reading. And then I was teaching master courses, and I had problems with reading too. So I've always had this problem. So because I can't somehow. I don't know why it is, but I start reading books and I drop it. So I feel like I need to speak about it because I think I'm not the only one who is having problems with reading. So I can read. I'm not dyslexic, but I just can't. I don't have the patience. So this work is really talking about my kind of relationship with books, honestly. And if it relates to other people's relationship with books, this is only a good thing. Talking about is it somehow connected to my wider practice, I think, I have to have a confession that this is my very first ever work in granite. I've never worked in that kind of material before. And I picked this material only because of it has to be outside and it has to be weatherproof and it has to last possibly long, and you know this material there is nothing unique in it, but it just works outside in weather conditions. And my main practice is it's like kind of pretty much like text and image related things, videos or paintings. But also this work is also text related, and it has text. And it has an image, but the image is three-dimensional. So this is how it probably, maybe if I answered your question. Yeah.
And Alistair, you know Marko's work very well, and I wondered whether you could talk to us a bit about how it works in the context of our university and also of Birmingham, but also how it sets up that international dialogue.
Yes, well, I think probably the easiest way is just to tell the story about how it happened in a way. I'd done a show with Marko and Raymond Peterman in Estonia, in Kumu. And rather interestingly, actually, Raymond's just had a show in Paris, the new David Zwirner there. And one of the images was of the world from a distance. And the byline underneath says, you can see the borders very clearly, and of course you can't. And it's the same sort of humour that Marko uses, though I'm not allowed to say you're funny, am I, Marko?
You can, but I never agree with you.
Because one of the things that I like about Marko's work very much, and a lot of the artists that I really most admire, is the ones who can juggle tragedy and comedy at the same time and keep that intensity. So how Marko came out to install an installation in a lavatory in the Pera Museum for a show. And Neil Lawson-May very kindly came out to see the show, which had about 32 other artists as well. And we were sitting at dinner afterwards, and I said to Marko, this wonderful man is coming to a dinner, and he likes to create sculpture in places, and he's wanting to do something in Aston University. And Marko said, oh, I must think of a sculpture. And so we were sitting at dinner with our Turkish host, and the Turkish host said, yes, oh well, I will support the model if you do something. So it was a wonderful, I think what is wonderful about his work, it just appeals, it's so universal, the way he talks about the family and the anxieties and problems we all have.
So let's turn to Roxanna and Birmingham. And so I wondered whether you could outline for us the local authority's public art strategy and how you involve artists in the early stages of developing art for the built environment.
Okay. So in 2015, a public art strategy was adopted by the Birmingham City Council, which was a collaboratively developed strategy working with the cultural sector as well as wider sectors in the built environment. And one of the initial outcomes of that, from my point of view, working in the council, was it meant a route in to work with the city design team, which is in planning and development. So as a culture officer, cultural, with networks in the cultural sector, I was able to kind of be a bit of a go-between and a bridge working within that context. The aims and the outcomes of the strategy itself, they're on the City Council website, but a quick overview, it was really about how do you improve the commissioning practices for public art in the city and find new funding streams and investment from multi-sectors. It's not just looking at culture, it's looking at a holistic built environment, and things like that could include, so when budgets are put forward for, say, public art, it's not just public art specifically, it's like street furniture and lighting and paving, and how can an artist be embedded from the early stages to do more interesting, high-quality public realm. And also working with ecologists, looking at biodiversity issues and environment. It's not just facades and hard landscaping and things like that. It's a real so many different ways in which artists can work in those contexts and enrich those environments for the people who are going to use it in the future. One of the things the public art strategy also touches on is the maintenance of public art, which is a kind of can be an afterthought in some circumstances, but it's very important to think about the financing of that going forward, and that's an issue that we've got in the city for existing artworks, especially ones in the council's portfolio. Like, they cost money to maintain, and we want them to be quality. We want to respect the initial kind of idea that the artist had and keep the integrity, but that's not always the case if there wasn't a budget set aside for it. So that's a challenge, but we're recognised, and we're working with partners to look at how we can resolve. And I guess just in terms of, so there's a kind of aims and then outcomes really, it's kind of recognising the ecology of the creative sector and the artists in the city and beyond, and what they can do to make Birmingham a kind of more kind of enjoyable place, and kind of, I don't know, like I think what Jonathan said about the everyday and encountering something interesting in your everyday. So it's not just it's an interruption to kind of more commercial spaces. I think one of the examples very quickly I'm going to talk about is Smithfield. So as a result of this strategy, because Smithfield, which is the redevelopment of the markets in the city centre, because that City Council owned land, we're able to have more kind of steer around how arts and culture can be embedded as an anchor for that site. and therefore are able to have more conversations much earlier on about the role of arts and culture and artists and commissioning artists and public art plans right from the beginning when other design team members are involved. So that's one example. And very quickly, Pedimore, a totally different random example really, because that's an employment site, a very large employment site in the north of the city. Again, it's partly council-owned land, so we're able to get in very early, having conversations about arts plans for the sites, the relevance, what kind of site-specific arts commissioning opportunities there might be. And also within the community engagement process, having artists involved working alongside marketing teams and things like that. So, yeah, very quick.
Thank you.
Hopefully, covered a few things
so,
there.
Theresa, can I turn to you now? And I should ask you about HS2 and how HS2 is responding to a change in art dynamics and change in art practice in the public realm. No longer the imposition of public art, but rather developing a more dynamic set of relationships between artists and communities. I'd be really interested to hear your work in that area.
Thank you. So I think the short answer is by working with artists who are sort of interested in social practice and relational aesthetics. But essentially HS2 has a design vision which is about people, place and time, and that is to design every aspect of the project, bearing in mind the impact on the people that will be using it and the places that it'll be passing through. For us, it's a great opportunity to invite artists to actually spend a lot of time researching the contexts for their work and the people and places that are affected by those projects. So we see it as primarily as an opportunity for artists to work with the communities through which the project is passing and to support our community engagement work in that way. We have a kind of a philosophy to be a good neighbour to the communities that we pass through. A key principle for me is that the work should be inclusive. So we like to think about artists working with communities to foster collaboration and to facilitate local engagement around the long-term impact of the project. So to really kind of raise debate and discussion about what regeneration projects mean for those communities that are affected by them. And really we do that through a series of artist residencies initially. So I mean this project, the first phase is going to take 10 years to come about. London to Birmingham will be completed in 2029, hopefully. And actually for us, that is a fantastic opportunity to work with artists over an extended period of time and to really look at very different ways of researching and celebrating the communities and local stories and the people that make up those places. Apart from inclusivity, I think sustainability is a key for us as well. So one aspect of the project is something called the Green Corridor. So we're looking at the way that this infrastructure project can improve the green spaces through which it's passing, through the landscaping, through urban and rural locations. We're also looking at the ways that artists can support that work. So through sort of looking at landscape, but also through inviting communities to use those landscapes in different ways. So opening up rights of way, looking at creating new spaces for communities to use. So that just gives a little bit of an insight.
Thank you. And Abid, so building on your role for the Arts Council, tell us a bit about the importance of public art for engaging diverse and non-artistic audiences and providing a focal point for social change.
Well, I mean, certainly from my experience, I mean, I used to be a student here and I've come back to study my MBA, and the changes I've seen in 20 years since I graduated the first time and coming back onto campus, it's a completely different demographic on campus. And I think when I walked past your work earlier, for me, I guess the litmus test of art is it evokes an emotion, and it just made me smile. It made me smile because I was on the way to the library and I had to pick up a book on operations management, which I don't want to read, but I need to read. But I think on a more serious note, I think in terms of public art, what becomes really interesting for me in a city like Birmingham is how much the city has changed since the war, so the last 60, 70 years. My parents migrated over in the 60s and the 70s. And how do you make art relevant to the different communities that call Birmingham home? And that's where I think public art has a really powerful role to play, because it can bring people and communities together outside of the white boxes and the cubes and the buildings that sometimes people feel uncomfortable walking into. And for me, I think what's really powerful about public art is it can actually be designed to evoke a range of emotions. So I think Jonathan's journey from Ikon to Aston kind of highlighted a range of emotions for us. And certainly when we look at what's happening in the world today, in Beirut, in Hong Kong, what was happening in London at the weekend, I think the role of people coming together and people beginning to question, challenge, and kind of ask questions that we haven't asked previously. And for me, I think what's really fascinating about public art, I see it in two respects. I guess it's the art that's commissioned with permission. So it's the work that we choose to put in public spaces. And then there's the work that appears suddenly without any permission or consent, and what that can generate. And I think in Birmingham we have the best of both. We get the work that's commissioned and work that kind of comes from the community. One thing which is really interesting for me, which I'd love to explore further, I guess, is how can we make some of that work relevant? And I think that was very pertinent in Jonathan's story about the family, something that reflects Birmingham as it is today. Because one of the really interesting things that we face, I guess, with public art is over time, our perceptions and our views can change. So what happens in South Africa around the Rhodes legacy, for example, what's happening around Gandhi's legacy, depending on where you are. So I think there's a really fascinating question around how do you create public art that's relevant, inclusive, but at the same time can actually weather the test of time. Because I think as our communities change, how we respond to the kind of stimulus around us changes too.
Thank you. So can I open out with a question to you all? So how do you see public art developing in the city during a continuing period of austerity when public investment remains under pressure? Who'd like to start us off? Yes, please.
I feel like I started to talk about that a little bit. I mean, one of the things, like I say, there's something, I think Aston University will key partner around the cultural investment inquiry, which looks at, and also to say the context of the public art strategy, there's also a wider cultural strategy that looks at, I guess, the interrelation between public art as a sphere and also wider cultural context. So, you know, that's an issue for the sector as a whole. In terms of specific artist commissions in the built environment, I think we're looking at how we can use some Section 106 money differently, for example, in terms of one way to look at investment. And then there's something called a community infrastructure levy, which there are cultural items that are on this list, which is a special list that basically, where there's development in the city, if there's pooled funding that goes into that, potentially those things can be invested in going forward. I mean, those are two to kick off with anyway,
For us, it's very much about working with the existing cultural organisations in the city. So what we don't want to do is bring outside consultants in to help us deliver arts and culture in Birmingham. You know, so our focus is to work with the existing organisations we're already working with, Ikon, Eastside Projects, Grand Union, and there will be many more to come over the ensuing period. For us, it's about sort of helping to kind of seed, fund programmes that have the potential of being sustainable because they are, based in the community, the organisations that are based here, who have the knowledge, who have the local knowledge, who understand the kind of arts ecology in the city. So for us, that's a really important aspect of what we're doing.
I guess from an Arts Council perspective, it's more a question of actually how do we begin to shift the conversation around how the funding is invested and distributed. So the strategy that we're working on for the next 10 years is very much around people, places and communities. So I think what I'm really interested in is how do we get communities a bit more engaged in the conversations with our arts leaders and our arts institutions in terms of co-curating the spaces that they want to be within.
I would say it was up to the artists, because the artists, if you involve artists who engage with people, like Marko does, it makes things happen and you get money from people involved in the area. For instance, a friend of Jonathan's and mine called Wakas Khan did an exhibition up at Manchester, and he realised that the people immediately outside the museums were totally uninvolved with the museum. So the taxi drivers were there. He could speak the same language. He comes from Lahore. And so he just simply, in the 3 places he had exhibitions, he put up welcome. And it was so successful that the museum afterwards bought those 3 signs in Neil. And I think, getting the right artists involved with what's going on is what's important.
And I think it depends on the artist, of course, somebody more introvert, somebody more extrovert, but I think deep inside everybody wants to approach the audience. So I think working in public places is a great challenge, but I think this is exactly what we artists are actually trying to achieve, even in a gallery space or in under the roof as well, not only on a street. But I think this is everybody's dream, that you get as much attention and as many audience as possible. So I think, that's all I can probably say.
You've all suggested things about working in partnership, and I wonder whether there are new ways of working in partnership that we'll have to develop in the future in order to make sure that public art thrives.
I think partnership working's been around for a long time, born out of necessity. I mean, we're looking at developing relationships with other national organisations that have contemporary art programmes, so like the Canal and Rivers Trust or the National Trust, because we kind of recognise that we can't fund everything, and it's not appropriate for us to do so. It's the kind of taxpayers' money that's going into the project, so we have to be, but we can kind of bring leverage to kind of projects by working with others.
Definitely. I was going to say the same. I mean, the City Council recognises that we're very much more of a broker and a facilitator. And there's an initiative called the Cultural Compact that's coming forward, where more representatives from the cultural sector and beyond, other sectors that are of a massive importance, like health and wellbeing, public health, universities, etc., to sit around a table and to be kind of collectively supportive and help make those decisions around culture for the city. And ideally, I mean, who knows how this will pan out, but if a public art subgroup or how that is represented within that framework could be part of that initiative, how they move forward. I mean, the other thing to say in terms of partnerships, the public art strategy that we have for this city is only up until 2019 and needs refreshing, as does the cultural strategy, and that is always a groundswell of like partnership activity and conversations and dialogue and reaching out with communities and discussion, and none of that is possible without partnerships and dialogue. So making sure it's truly reflective and representative of what the ambition is for the city.
I think what's been really interesting about actually seeing the work on campus today, Aston isn't a university that you would normally associate with arts and culture. And I think it's really important for us to have those partnerships that go outside of those traditional kind of spaces, because my hope would be that the students that engage with Marko's work recognise that there's an opportunity for them to connect with arts and culture, whether it's as audience members, whether it's joining boards of arts and cultural organisations in the future, and just recognising, I guess, some of the transferable skills that students will get at Aston University are some of the skills that we're looking for in the arts and cultural sector. So our partnerships need to kind of go beyond what conventional wisdom has taught us in terms of where we need art and culture, and kind of make sure we're permeating space where art hasn't been as visible previously.
Well, that certainly happened. And Marko, I don't think we told you, but it has a bit of controversy, your sculpture. So one student complained, and the student said, this is offensive to us. You're saying that we don't work hard. And we then had a dialogue with the student, and we said, well, this is absolutely wonderful. We wouldn't have had this conversation without it. We've listened to your views. And actually, the student began to understand why the sculpture was there. But it took a little bit of time. And we felt we had really done what we were wanting to do with the sculpture, because it got some discussion around the art.
That's interesting, because I thought, because most of my works have been, I don't know, not wanting to be provocative, but usually people are exactly the same, split in two, and those who like it, those who hate it, and say that I'm offending somebody. And I was actually thinking that this work is the first ever work I achieved, which is not offensive. Thank you very much. I did it again. I did it again.
The bloody family ones you've done, yeah.
I think the issue was that the student didn't necessarily have a sense of humour.
Well, you don't need to have it.
No.
Yeah.
So I think the panel would be happy to take questions from the audience if there's anyone who would like to ask a question. I think I'm required to get someone to give you the microphone.
Thanks. I've got more books at home than I could possibly read, but it makes me feel good. What's the best public art city? How would Birmingham become known as a public arts city? And are there any comparators around the world that are doing it right?
Well, I'd like to just say Birmingham has got a good reputation for public art, but I live in Bristol. And I think we've got a great reputation for public art commissioning, and it's partly to do with the local authority, pushing developers to spend money through the development process through Section 106. But it's also about the arts organisations in the city looking further afield, as Ikon does, as Eastside Projects do, and commissioning work beyond their four walls. And I think you're doing really well.
But I think we're falling way behind what's happening in Asia and elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I'm just really interested. This is a really interesting debate to be having around culture, particularly given the context we're in at the moment globally. Abid, your point about Aston not necessarily being a space for creative, potentially the arts, to be embedded, I find that really interesting too. I'm a new member of staff. And actually, I have seen creative practice and innovation and design in quite a lot of what goes on here, and it's almost accidental or incidental. And then there are obviously spaces where it happens on purpose. I'm wondering about the link between the way we understand the arts and what they mean, and particularly community arts projects, and what goes on in education. And actually in schools, and the way in which children are introduced to the concept of art, and how that fits with the whole idea of public art in a space like this.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, because Helen and I reconnected a couple of years ago, and part of that reconnection was exactly that conversation around, I guess, all the creativity that goes on campus, but actually doesn't get packaged as part of the Aston offer, and how we could kind of connect the students and the staff into the arts and cultural ecology. We've recently done our 10-year consultation with the sector. What's fascinating is the public talks about arts and culture in a very different way to the way we do. So we sometimes get caught up in the terminology, the buzzwords, and even the language of art has become inaccessible for the communities that we're trying to engage with. And that's where I think public art has such a powerful role to play, because you can encounter it when you least expect it, and it evokes a reaction or an emotion. And then I guess the job for the arts and cultural ecology is, how do we kind of latch onto that interest and kind of nurture it and kind of develop it, whether someone wants to become an audience member, whether they want to work in the sector, or they want to develop their creative practice. And certainly for the Arts Council, I think we have to do more work with the organisations and the institutions and the communities that nurture our young people to kind of make sure we're a viable option for them. And that varies from art form to art form. So if you want to be a ballet dancer, if you're not spotted by the age of 4 or 5, you're not going to become a ballet dancer. And I think we need to kind of recognise the kind of journeys that people go on and actually create the conditions for people to engage with that. And the other thing that I think really inspired me about the work that Aston are doing is just that kind of data that we have in terms of socioeconomic background. So actually some of the students that come to this university do come from some of the most kind of challenging and difficult circumstances, and how can we then create an environment where they're also open to exploring new opportunities beyond what they've come here as their primary driver.
I'd like to back that up because I'm just involved in a project at the moment which is studying the language that's used in the business world and the language used in the art world. And the word opportunities comes up far more in the business world, and institutions and closing things down comes up in the art world far too often. And really, there's no difference between art and life, and the sooner we realise that, the better.
So within the cultural strategy that the city's adopted, there's a chapter called Next Generation, and there's a creative future strategy within that. And that's a sort of pledge that a lot of the arts and cultural organisations have signed up to talk about kind of how they can support children and young people to engage and have their first experiences within cultural, very different art forms. And what that journey looks like from, participant to creator to leader, or like a critical audience member. And also I'm just interested, aside from that, in kind of built environment education. So obviously learning about public realm and built environment and spaces around you and your emotional responses to space. And then where does that path take you? And then if it takes you to a built environment profession, there's no crossover there with culture, as I understand it, in the way it's taught. So there's a lot of opportunity and potential for universities offering those courses, or whatever route you take to that profession, to do a lot more collaborative working at student stage. I know some places are really good at kind of looking at experimenting and have particular projects, but as a whole, like landscape architecture and things like that, I think there could be a lot more kind of collaboration, potentially, with culture and arts.
I think that there is a thing beyond public art in the sense of the sculpture, which is the aesthetic care that's taken in the things that are all around us. One of the reasons people might say that Aston isn't a natural place for culture is that we tend to buy the absolutely cheapest thing we can put our hands on. And now, just to be clear, there is no necessary correlation between expense and beauty. What we do, as I've observed here, is we don't, of all the things that cost the same price, it could be a chair, it could be a desk. Look at that table in front of you. Look at that thing that's right there. This is a serious point.
Students' Union, be careful what you say.
Well, look at it anyway. I'll take whatever the Students' Union wants to say to me about it. So if you go shopping around, which one can do, you can find all sorts of things that aren't very expensive that actually are very interesting and aesthetically desirable. And one of the ways in which we can have, I think, a very large impact on many people is to exercise care in what we buy, not just in what we spend. And I think that that's something that's absent in most purchasing programs. It's always the case you have a budget. But if you go and look for tables, chairs, simple things, you will find some that are richly designed and others that are like that. And we don't spend, in my experience, the energy and give the thought to these things which mean that people start to observe, let's call it beauty for want of a better word, or something that titillates them as they walk around, as they sit down. And I think that we're in danger of thinking that art is something that goes in a program or it's encased in an object, whereas in fact it is indeed, as you say, all around us. There is no difference between life and art. There's also no difference between life and ugliness. And Birmingham, for example, has exhibited some extraordinarily ugly things, and it's one of its problems as a city to attract creative talent. But I think that's a dimension that we ought to talk about, not just works of art, as this beautiful sculpture with the books, but the fact that we can make artistic choices in everyday actions and everyday decisions.
And you're very right. One of my failures when I was at Deutsche Bank was actually not noticing certain purchase or actually throwing away policies, discharge. Because while I was there, and I was involved in buying art for about 18 years, they'd also merged with Morgan Grenfell, and their most proud object was a beautiful partner's desk that was in several of the paintings involved with that, and without anyone consulting anyone, that table disappeared in a redecoration program. Nobody was consulted, it just disappeared. And so these decisions are made in supposedly well-run organizations very, very, far too easily. I totally agree with you.
Anyone else want to reply to George's challenge?
I just wanted to comment that quite often arts programs or arts and culture programs for new buildings look at the purchasing budgets of the furniture as an opportunity to kind of extend, the design or the good design and good aesthetics throughout the building. So I've worked on a number of hospital projects, and one of the key budgets that we look at is the furniture and the interior design, just to make the spaces more pleasant to be in if you're a member of the public and wait in the waiting areas, or sort of passing through long corridors, sort of depressing corridors, and try and kind of they're very small budgets, but it's still possible to do something good with those and make kind of spaces more pleasurable to go through.
I think similarly, the advice that we give to developers when they're putting their public art plans together is to look at the potential for like street furnishings and things like that, and how they can be enhanced with, looking at specific artist commissions that are specific design commissions, and whether working alongside the design team they can influence that positively.
So I think that I'm told that time is up, and I would thank the panel, thank Jonathan, thank the panel, thank Neil for initiating this fantastic evening, and you have my promise that we will continue at Aston University to engage in this really, really important endeavour. Thank you very much. Thank you.